The changing role of the local civilian population in irregular warfare. A 24-minute presentation held at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, Shrivenham, on the 24th of June 2009. The presenter is Dr. Thomas Ridd from the Johns Hopkins University.
I have not prepared a proper lecture or presentation, but I will actually just have a conversation with you about the subject as announced, which is mostly drawn from a new book which was just published 2 weeks ago, titled of War 2.0. It sounds quite trendy and hot, but actually it's a serious book, and our publisher just loved that title. Turns out to stick, so in a way good. I will put forward here a thesis of quite a general nature. Let me give you a little bit of background on how and why I and my co-author Marc Hecker from Paris, why we actually engaged in that project. I was in Paris before I went to Washington. The French MOD requested 2 studies from the French think tank, which we applied for. One study was on the question how the most stress-tested land forces have reacted to the new media environment. And the cases they wanted us to look at was the United States, the UK, and Israel. And the other study they wanted to have done was how their respective adversaries have reacted to the same environment. And when I say environment, I mean modern media technology, communication technology, in a population-centric war among the people. So here the civilian population comes very much into play, both locally and at home. And when I say at home, I mean both in a traditional sense that think Vietnam, the moral support of the home front is undermined. But at home here also means, particularly in Europe, means population where very small radical segments are potentially supporting the cause of the adversary in the field. So a very complicated sort of constellation, which is to a certain extent probably new. The big general question is, how has telecommunication affected political violence? This is a very big question, I know. But let me now zoom into a couple of very detailed learning experiences for you. The thesis here I want to put forward is that new technologies in a combination with new ideologies or just refurbished ideologies have driven a wedge between terrorism and insurgency. I will explain what I mean by that in the next couple of minutes. And for some militant groups, therefore, the entry into political violence has been lowered and their resilience has been improved. But for the same groups, success has become more difficult. And the catchphrase here in fat print is meant to capture this new sort of almost dilemma from the perspective of militant groups, that they cannot lose because they're resilient at the extreme end, both in the field or in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, even Somalia, but also actually here in Europe. And let me furnish this with some details for you. The rest of this quite short presentation is structured into 2 parts. First, I take the perspective of the counterinsurgent. And in the second part, I'll take the perspective of the insurgent, if you like, or of militant group. And then we can combine the 2 perspectives by looking at sort of what's actually new here. Probably everybody in the room here is reasonably familiar with counterinsurgency thinking and has heard of the field manual or the equivalent British doctrines and publications. So counterinsurgency thinking, just to sort of define it in a very concise fashion, is understood as a competition between the insurgent and the counterinsurgent for local support, for the trust of the local neutral population in order to get support, from funding to participation to just being left alone in order to achieve one's goals. So all those expressions about human terrain, population-centric warfare, this, I think, is really the gist of counterinsurgency theory today. I think the foreword to Field Manual 3-0 in the United States operations, this big 3.0 operations manual, which is the capstone manual of the US Army, in the foreword captures the change. Perhaps in the right words when General Wallace, who wrote the foreword, head of TRADOC, called it a revolutionary change, because for the first time in the history of the United States Armed Forces, the stabilization operations are on the same level as offensive and defensive operations. And the population is understood, using Rupert Smith's phrase, as a central element in this war among the people. Here's the state of the art of counterinsurgency thinking in a very simplified fashion, of course. But since you are familiar with that, I won't go into more detail. What I would like to do, secondly, is to add some historical perspective to this change. When I say soil, Well, when we say soil in the title of this presentation, we use actually a metaphor that is quite old. I've just finished a long article which was discussed yesterday on the Kings of War blog briefly on the 19th century origins of counterinsurgency thinking. And the origin is really the French operation in Algeria, which began in 1830, and in 1840 they had their version of Pétréus coming in by the name of Thomas Robert Bugeaud. Some of you might have heard this name. He was one of France's greatest generals, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, of the 100 Days, and of the Peninsular War in Spain. And he instinctively and immediately understood the relevance of the population in Algeria. Mind you, this is the first time the French army confronted a culturally very alien conflict in North Africa with a very strong Muslim undercurrent. There was talk of jihad even at the time. Abdelkader, who was also a well-known figure, was leading the insurgency then. And in the context of this operation, Bugeaud developed indigenous affairs officers. He developed a doctrine of what he called the Bureau Arabe, which is, if you like, a precursor of PRTs, military installations that had a strong civilian element in order to work with tribes and basically the administrative carrots to help tribes that cooperated with the French military and with French civilians and administrators in Algeria. And in the context of this operation, there was this metaphor used that the population, I'm quoting here, one of Bugeaud's disciples, Lyotet, who was the second field marshal in France, buried next to Napoleon, famously said that the pirate, that's how the insurgents were called at the time, the pirate is a plant that only grows on fertile ground or on fertile soil. And the aim of the counterinsurgent, or of the military forces in that context, to make that soil less fertile. And then in that context, he used also this expression of the oil slick, or the ink blot, which suppose most of you are also familiar with. Essentially means that part of a region of a province can be stabilized, say a city, and then its surroundings, after it is administrated properly, can be enlarged like an ink spot on water or on soil. The key observation here in that first part of this presentation is what is today perceived as this new revolutionary change perhaps is actually a quite long trend that always happened in parallel to the modernization of Western armed forces, European armed forces, after the Napoleonic Wars. And that is to work with the local population and to improvise the instruments we have to do that. The new technology environment I mentioned earlier is very much a new development. What happened here in military thinking and doctrinal understanding of modern warfare is actually a journey back into the 19th century, just to sort of put it in provocative terms. Now let's turn around, since we are already in the 19th century, and go to the second part of the presentation and take the perspective of the insurgent, of militant groups, of rebels, of resistance fighters, however you want to call them, non-state militant actors, and look at the way they used telecommunication technology over history. And being, for all historians here in the room, this is very brute and blunt history, because I'm trying to discern a very long trend. So don't be shocked. But I think in the 19th century, what we saw is that telecommunication was used as a target by insurgents. In the 20th century, or rather after the First World War, telecommunication technology was used as a weapon by insurgents. And after the year 2000, in the 21st century, telecommunication technology is used as a platform. So we have targets. Think of T.E. Lawrence ripping down telegraph wires, or think of in Saudi Arabia, today's Saudi Arabia, destroying the Ottoman lines of communication. Think of, French resistance fighters in 1870 cutting German telegraph wires in the Franco-Prussian War, and so on. The entire 19th century, particularly the later half, is full of examples of insurgents attacking military communication in the form of telegraphy, and earlier on even optical telegraphy. Then radio, think of telecommunication as a weapon. Think of the Viet Cong undermining American public support. The operation, the Tet offensive, was designed to undermine American support. The Battle of Mogadishu, when Aidid attacked American support in 1993, I think also a very deliberate design on the part of the Somali fighters to send the message via CNN that this is a bad idea, this operation. And then in the 21st century, what we see, and this is really, I think, a new phenomenon because the technology is so new, we have communication among insurgents, among militant groups, that is happening through the internet, through mobile phones, through modern information technology. And what happens is they cover a spectrum of utilities. They use information not only to intimidate the adversary as a propaganda tool or to undermine public support as they did in the past, but they use the technology as a platform to do all sorts of things. Knowledge transfer, radicalization, recruitment, fundraising, even create new forms of organization almost, just by virtue of using the same technologies for really your own life today in almost all aspects. I think we intuitively understand that information technology has become a platform. And the public domain has become way more important, particularly for militant groups who cannot afford to have a firewalled, secure system like modern armed forces can afford to do. In a way, that's what I mean by insurgency's journey into the 21st century. Modern information technology has become a far more important aspect of their operations and even of their existence. How does that relate to the role of the population in modern irregular warfare? The first part, it's very clear. The population more and more came into the center of the attention of Western armed forces. Now the reverse trend has happened for insurgents, I argue, that the civilian population, civilian popular support, the soil in Lyotet's image, or the sea in Mao's more popular image in which the fish, the insurgent, swims, the sea has become less important for the insurgent, for some groups. That's the thesis of this talk. Why? Let me try to illustrate what I mean by tail in order to make the counter-argument. Some of you might be familiar with the theory of the long tail, which was developed by Chris Anderson, who is the editor of Wired magazine. He tried to understand how businesses like Amazon.com or iTunes or eBay work today, because what the key difference between them and traditional companies is. And the key difference is that the long tail, think of products, think of books on Amazon or songs on iTunes, products that only have a very small number of people that are actually interested in buying them, are certainly becoming profitable, because finding them online, ordering them, having them shipped to you, or even downloading them has become so cheap that if you look at product curves, that even products that are not very popular in terms of there's not a high volume of demand like you need for a car in order to produce it, that new products become profitable. So the flat end of a demand curve suddenly becomes profitable and viable from a business perspective. Just to give you another example to illustrate how that theory applies, I think in the 80s, before the internet age, you had a similar logic. So this is not bound to happen on the internet. I'm giving you this example of surfers. You had surfers who decided that, well, they were so much into surfing that they wanted a better product. But the market, the firms to actually develop the better surfboards wasn't there. So they decided to take the initiative, develop those products on their own and improve them and perhaps even go to market later on. But the long tail this theory includes also elements of taking the initiative, going from the bottom up, a high level of bottom up innovation, of very much having peer groups without a hierarchy that tells them what to do, having peer groups act independently. And what we try to do in the book is to apply this logic, this theory, to political violence. And I think intuitively it applies pretty well. But what it can do, and that's what I meant by the initial thesis, that new technology drives a wedge between insurgency and terrorism. Okay, let's put it this way. If you are a traditional insurgent, let's take Hezbollah as an example, or even Hamas, what you want is popular support in the sense that you have a constituency, you're almost a political force. You are a political force in the case of both examples, and they have responsibility towards that constituency. There's a very low number of foreign fighters inside Hezbollah or Hamas. It's all Palestinian or all Lebanese, or almost entirely. And that even to a certain extent applies to the Taliban. So they are not what I'm talking about. They are still, to a certain extent, traditional insurgent groups because they rely on popular support. They have local agendas. They want to assume political power realistically, which in the case of Hezbollah we just saw is actually quite realistic. But then there are also other groups that are sort of stuck in the terrorism phase of an insurgency. Very violent, a very high level of extreme ideas and extreme ideologies. That's what I mean by political views, ideas, goals. If we look at the extremists that decide to join the jihadi cause in Europe, I think what we see is that the motivations why people join those groups are very diverse. There's not a single motivation, there's not a single cause. There's a large set of causes that drives people. Some are personal, some are very specific, some are to create a global caliphate. There's no common denominator other than a certain level of frustration. I mean, there's no agreement among experts on how radicalization happens, how it happens, and I think it's impossible to actually generalize because it's such a diverse thing. The bracket around it is just that. It's an extreme, mostly it has some Islamic connection, of course. It's an extreme movement at the fringe of society. At the fringe of society everywhere, really. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia, and even in the UK, in Germany, in Europe, to a significantly lesser extent in the United States, interestingly enough. And the point is that the technology that extremists are able to use enables them to find each other, to find a motivation to act, to find a justification to act, to find the methods to act online. Rusi just published a report, I think last week, on how messy, in a way, radicalization is, and this sort of bottom-up terrorism works in the UK, and how lucky the intelligence services were, because they were so far able to do something against it. Now, I'm closing just by summing up what I said. In a way, the trend we see in the counterinsurgency debate in all modern European and North American armed forces, really, and in NATO, to focus more and more on the population, is perhaps unintentionally, and that's a key point here, counteracted by global jihadi extremists who focus less on the population. And I would like to close on an optimistic note here, because what it means for extremists is a loss of control. It's a very high cost. They cannot possibly turn themselves, as they would like to do, into a classical insurgency. They cannot migrate up the demand curve. It's like running a party with a permanent support of 0.1%. It doesn't work. You can't ever assume political power if you only rely on partly self-recruited, let's speak plain English here, nutcases who join your movement. And that, I think, is the future of Al-Qaeda. It certainly looks that way right now. And by focusing more and more on the population and trying to pursue an existential approach, eradicate terrorism at the root, I think this is still the underlying assumption in many high strategic quarters in the West. By trying to pursue an existential strategy, we might actually do some of those extremists a favor, because they then have a higher mobilization potential. But I think the fear that Al-Qaeda might actually realistically take over an entire region in the sense of becoming a classical insurgency, that fear is unfounded in the sense that what would happen is probably a lot more complex. And instead of just focusing on the population, I think there are other areas that need more focus.
Dr. Ridd was asked the following 3 questions. Question 1. Classical insurgency relies on at least benign support from a substantial percentage of the local population, but would you agree that insurgents at the extreme end are not dependent upon that environment?
Yes, I think it is not dependent on that environment. That makes it, of course, very difficult to theorize about it. We have to talk about the situation in a very granular fashion. I hope this answers your question if I go back to one of our case studies, the Israeli case, Hezbollah, but also Hamas. We were in Israel for 2 weeks and interviewed a couple of very senior military people, including Moshe Yaalon, who was the former chief of staff during the Second Intifada, who basically succeeded in getting the level of violence down drastically, with very questionable means sometimes, but still, he succeeded. What struck us in Israel was the extent to which Israeli senior military decision makers and politicians did not even assume that they would be able to solve the problem. They have become very cynical. Cynical in a positive sense. Cynical in the sense that they realized that then Khalutz and Olmert announcing their ambition to crush Hezbollah in 2006 was a grave mistake. You don't crush Hezbollah. It just doesn't work. You can't crush Hezbollah because it is an insurgency that actually has popular support. And it is quite sophisticated. So nobody said that in 2008, 2009, in the operation in the Gaza Strip. So I think there was very much an understanding that we need to manage our expectations about what we can achieve. I'm saying this as an answer to your question because I think the Hamas case, the Gaza Strip case, actually It's very confusing but also instructive at the same time, because what we have here is probably the most extreme in terms of its political views, one of the most extreme insurgencies that are actually not only a terrorist movement but also an insurgency that has some legitimacy in that patch of land at least, because of this exceptional situation with Israel next door as its arch enemy. And I think what I mean by granular is we have to look at those cases and then here also see, okay, this is a very unusual situation that you have both at the same time. Extremism and a high level of popular support.
Question 2. A recent article suggests that the commercial network analogy doesn't work with organisations like Al-Qaeda. To what extent is talking about long tails unhelpful?
Well, two things on that question. First, that's why I briefly mentioned the surfing example. It's not just about selling stuff. It's also about making stuff. So the logic behind it is often a non-profit, non-commercial logic. Think of Linux and the participation there. So it's a broader theory, but that your basic criticism is of course still valuable. How can it just be applied to political violence? Well, we thought, particularly after looking at the problem from a historical perspective as well, and not only in the book but also beyond the book, we basically thought, okay, what we saw in the media environment, in the telecommunication environment today, I'm convinced this is unprecedented. Historically unprecedented. Briefly, what we basically saw is a marriage of monologish telecommunication technologies, TV, radio, even newspapers, which is not telecom, but you had a few people deciding about what many people are supposed to read. And on the other hand, you had point-to-point communication becoming ever more sophisticated, telegraph, telephone, and so on. What you now have is basically a marriage of mass monologue and private dialogue into mass dialogue. We are very careful not to sound too sort of hypey, trendy in the book, despite the title. And that's also why we keep the historic focus. But I think you cannot go back to history to understand what is happening today. You can go back to history to sort of immunize yourself against overhyping the change. And I think that is very, very important, and we try to do this. But at the same time, we should also recognize that perhaps some analogies from the business sector or the non-profit sector are instructive.
Question 3. You said you were going to end on an optimistic note. How do you deal with terrorists who do not necessarily want political power or to extend their network, but believe there are enough like-minded people already who will perpetuate their ideas?
Clearly, this is the $60,000 question. My note was both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time. The pessimistic version of it would be to say that terrorism, Islamic, jihadi extremism, is a phenomenon of our time, which we basically just have to accept as being there, and what we have to do is minimize its effects and its costs, and perhaps its size or its appeal. I think that's what we should do. I don't think it can be ended anytime soon. So it's very unrealistic in my view. But if we realize that minimizing its negative effects is basically the goal, that raises the question whether trying to crush it in some particular spot with means that are questionable. Basically I'm raising the very tricky question of making a cost-benefit calculus. When are you creating more terrorists than you're killing, to put it in very blunt language? I think that question is still out there to be answered. And focusing on counterinsurgency without looking at the counter-terrorism effects of it, because it's essentially a separated debate. What we try to do here is reconnect the terrorism and the insurgency debate. I think if we talk about Al-Qaeda, and after all, Al-Qaeda is the reason for why NATO is in Afghanistan, we shouldn't delude ourselves and only look at counterinsurgency from a historical perspective, like I think many in the United States in particular did in that counterinsurgency debate. There's a risk of biasing your perspective.
Please note that any views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official thinking and policy of their organisation, Her Majesty's Government, or the Ministry of Defence.